I really get excited about talking about Esther. We're going to talk about Esther and we're going to talk about Job, which are kind of night and day in terms of stories. I mentioned last week, I probably didn't know that much about the book of Esther growing up or thinking about it as one of the books of the Bible that I had a particularly big interest in. But I mentioned last week when I was in seminary, the seminary I attended, Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, had a requirement that you study both Greek and Hebrew, which is not, every seminary doesn't do that, but Fuller did. And you were required to take 3 courses in one and 1 course in the other. And so I took my 3 courses in Greek, and then I decided to take 3 courses in Hebrew, which meant I am a masochist. And I did it the summer of 1984. And it was offered as all 3 classes all in one. In other words, a 12-hour class. You went to class every day for 3 hours a day every day, Monday through Friday. And it was, I want to say it was 8 to 11 every morning of those 5 days a week. Here's just a clue about this. On the very first day of class, there were, I think, 20, somewhere between 23 and 25 of us in the class on the first day of class. By the last day of class, there were 6 of us. Because on the first week or 2, most of the people dropped it. And it was the summer of '84. I had started dating Janine in the spring of '84, so we were dating. The Olympics were in Los Angeles in '84. You know, I was in Pasadena. The Olympics were happening that summer. And so it was a busy summer in lots of ways, but the thing that I still remember in my little studio apartment there, we had a vocabulary test every day.
Oh my God.
Every day we had a vocabulary test. And so what I would do, I'd probably foolishly, would stay up too late with Janine, talking to Janine, on the phone with Janine. I'd go to bed, I would set my alarm for 5:30 or 6 and cram for the test, the Hebrew vocabulary test. I would memorize 20 or 25 Hebrew words. We'd take the test the very first thing. I would take the test and then promptly forget all those words because there's only so much space in my brain. And that was how I spent the summer of 1984. And I'm really glad I did, because Fuller had a interesting way of teaching foreign language. I'd already taken Greek, and their way of teaching what they call the inductive method, which meant you didn't start with like conjugating verbs or to be, or learning this is my pen and that is my cat, or those kinds of things. Like when I took French, the pen of my uncle is on the desk, or those kind of things. When I took French in college, the way you learned Greek, and the way you learned Hebrew was, in Greek we used the book of Acts, and we started with Acts chapter 1 verse 1. And put it up on the board in Greek and said, well, what is the first word? Well, we had to, after we learned the alphabet, we said, here's the first word. And we figured out what that word meant. Let's go to the second word. Now let's go to the third word. And we didn't finish the book of Acts in the 3 courses of Greek that I took. But that was the method. You just started reading a book of the Bible and just taking it one word at a time. So Greek was the book of Acts, but when it came time for Hebrew, we used the same method, but the book was Esther. And so when we started the Hebrew class, Esther chapter 1, verse 1. What is the first word? The first word was Malek in Hebrew, which is the word for king. As I've said before, Hebrew is at least for me, I had taken French in high school and college, and I had already taken Greek. But with each language, they got progressively harder, because French at least is the same alphabet. Greek's alphabet shares some similarity to our alphabet, you know. You've seen them at fraternities and sororities and things like that, the Greek alphabet. But Hebrew looks nothing like that alphabet to us. It looks like chicken scratch. It's written from right to left instead of left to right. And it has no vowels, only consonants. So, it's a challenging language, which is one reason the class shrunk so rapidly. But at the end of that, I probably worked harder in that class than any in my life to pass, and I think got an A-. But the other benefit of that, besides having a rudimentary understanding of Hebrew that has served me somewhat over the years, is I got to know the book of Esther really well. Because I literally read it a word at a time. So I grew to really appreciate the book of Esther, because the book of Esther is kind of an unusual book in lots of ways. And anybody know what is perhaps the most, what is different about the book of Esther than the other 65 books of the Bible?
Doesn't mention God.
It doesn't mention God. You might say, how does the book get into the Bible that doesn't mention God? Well, we'll get to that question as we go along. But yes, Esther is the only book of the Bible that does not mention God. But that doesn't mean God is not felt in the book. God's presence is not there. It's just the name of God is never mentioned in the book. So it's a relatively short book, but we won't have time to obviously read it, all the way through, even though it's only 10 chapters. But let's set the stage. We talked about this period in the history of Israel and Judah, the northern kingdom, the 10 northern tribes, as we say, attacked by the Assyrians, carted off into virtual slavery, intermarried with other foreign people, become what by the New Testament we call the Samaritans. The southern kingdom escapes the Assyrian onslaught in the 8th century BC. But in the 6th century BC, as we've talked about the last couple of weeks, the Babylonian Empire conquers Judah and takes the cream of the crop of the Judeans into exile in Babylon, modern Iraq, and we call that the Babylonian exile. The Babylonian Empire is conquered by the Persian Empire. And the emperor or king of Persia, Cyrus, is the one who then allows the Jews to return back to Palestine, back to Judea. And that return happens, as we talked about last week, recounted in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. They go back to rebuild the temple, which had been destroyed by the Babylonians. They go back years later to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Nehemiah being the one who gets that done. And this comes it comes in stages. Not every Jew is taken into captivity, and not everyone goes back to Jerusalem at the same time. They come in sort of waves. And some never return. Some Jews remain in what we would today call Iran or Iraq and never go back to Judea. There were Jewish communities in Persia, in what we now call Iran and Iraq. There were Jewish communities there for centuries. And to be a Jew today in Iran or Iraq would be a pretty dangerous place to be. But in times when there was more tolerance among the Muslim caliphs and leaders, there were Jewish communities and Christian communities in both Iran and Iraq. So some of the Jews remained in those places. So the book of Esther takes place after the Persians have conquered the Babylonians. It takes place during the reign of Xerxes. And, Xerxes is one of those historical figures that we know quite a bit about from sources other than the Bible. Xerxes is a pretty prominent and famous figure in ancient history, and is known for being somewhat in battle, brutal, being capricious, being short-tempered, being, there's a lot of things about, he is considered a military leader, but also somebody that often would flip his mind, in a second from one to the other. And so it starts with Xerxes. Now, Xerxes also in Hebrew is called Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus is another name. So Xerxes, Ahasuerus is the same person. And so we read at the beginning, it talks about Xerxes. It talks about he ruled over 127 provinces from India to Kush, which is basically the upper Nile region. And it talks about he was throwing a banquet for all of his nobles. And it says that this lasted for 6 months. And the first chapter is just talking about the extravagance of Xerxes, the wealth of extravagance of his. And it talks about, like in verse 6, the gardens, that had linen and silver rings, couches of gold and silver, mosaics of porphyry marble, mother of pearl, wine served in goblets of gold. This whole thing is meant to tell us just how wealthy and extravagant this king was. And 1:7. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink in his own way. For the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. So, now this party is only male. This is a male party. This is the way when, there's separation of men and women. It says, at the same time, verse 9, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for the women in the palace. So the queen is giving her own banquet for the women. The king is giving a banquet for the men. And verse 10, on the 7th day of this particular phase of the banquet, Xerxes was in high spirits from wine. Translation, he's drunk. And he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him. What were eunuchs in charge of? Harems. Yeah. For obvious reasons, they put eunuchs in charge of one. But he told his eunuchs, verse 11, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles. In other words, bring in the queen. I want to show her off in all of her beauty and splendor, for she was lovely to look at. But verse 12, but when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. The king wants you to go into the stag party and show off, and she's like, I'm not going in there with all those drunk men. So the king became furious and burned with anger. Now, so it says, he calls in his advisors. Verse 15, this has never happened. She's never, refused one of his commands before. Verse 15, what must be done to Queen Vashti? She hasn't obeyed the command of King Xerxes. So they put their heads together, and notice this is, I think, kind of funny, kind of, very anachronistic, very chauvinistic. Listen to what the nobles say in verse 16. Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but against all the nobles and the people of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she wouldn't come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. there will be no end of disrespect and discord. If the women find out that they can say no, if the women find out that they can disrespect and disobey their husbands, we will have chaos. If this word gets out that she has been allowed to get away with not obeying her husband, there will be chaos. But we got to do something about this. Verse 19, therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. So, she won't come into his presence. So to penalize her, we won't let her come into his presence. Since she won't come in, we're going to not let her come in. Well, I mean, isn't that what she wanted in the first place? But that's what they say. Well, okay, she's done. So, it says, also, let the king give her royal position to somebody else who's better than she. Then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. So the king and his nobles are pleased with this advice. And the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all the parts of the kingdom, to each province, in its own script, in its own language, proclaiming in each people's tongue that every man should be ruler over his own household. And thus was born male chauvinism. So she's out. That's queen. So how is he going to get a new queen? Well, they got an idea. They said, chapter 2, verse 2, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. In other words, we're going to scour the whole empire and get the most beautiful young virgins that there are and basically have a beauty contest. Maybe have a Miss Persia contest. And the winner will be the new queen. And they say, well, first, though, we're going to gather up all these beautiful young women. We're going to hand them over to the eunuchs and let them spend months in having beauty treatments, in the spas, basically, before they're ready to be brought into the king. So they're going to have this big royal contest, basically, to pick the most beautiful young woman in all the land to be the new queen. Now, side story, there happened to be, or not side, but there happened to be a Jew living there in the capital named Mordecai. And Mordecai had been part of the group brought over under the Babylonians. Back when Nebuchadnezzar invaded Judea, Mordecai was one of the exiles who was brought out of Judea to Babylon, and then after the Persians conquered the Babylonians, now he's in Persia. He's among those of the exiles. And he has a young cousin whose name is Hadassah, also known as Esther. And we're told that she was, this is 2:7. This girl, also known as Esther, was lovely in form and features, and Mordecai had taken her in as his own daughter when her parents had died. So he's a father figure to this young girl, Esther. But she's very beautiful, and they spy her, and they bring her in as one of the contestants in the royal beauty contest. And they put her in the harem. But it's important to note, 2:10, Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. So she hasn't revealed the fact that she's Jewish. Nobody knows that she's Jewish. She's been taken into the harem, and it says she has to go through a year of beauty treatments. Now, So she goes through a year of beauty treatments. Notice it's like 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 with perfume and cosmetics. And then she would have her night with the king. And so eventually her turn came to have a night with the king. And she got that one night, and then notice it says, verse 14, she wouldn't return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. So, he's having tryouts. Okay? Now, however, verse 17, the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women. She won his favor and approval, so he set a royal crown on her head and made her the queen instead of Vashti. So this young Jewish girl becomes the new queen, and they have a big celebration. And like, okay, well, that sounds good, but what's this have? But where are we going with this? Well, a little side note here at the end of chapter 2 that's going to come in and be important later. It says Esther kept her family background a secret. Now, 2:21. Mordecai, her cousin, surrogate father, would spend a lot of time hanging around the palace, on the outskirts of the palace, kind of checking up, making sure everything's going okay for her. So he's one of these guys who's just kind of on the periphery of the palace. And it says, verse 21, during the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Esther, who in turn reported it to the king and gave credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the 2 officials were hanged. And all this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. So Mordecai uncovers a conspiracy, helps to save the king's life, and they record all that in the annals, in the official history. Now keep that in mind. That's going to come into play down the road. Now, Xerxes had a chief advisor by the name of Haman. And Haman loved being in the position of pomp and circumstance. And so when he would go in to the palace or go through the gates and come back into the gates and out the gates, everybody would bow down to Haman. Except who? Mordecai. Mordecai was not going to bow down to him. Because Mordecai wasn't going to bow to anyone other than God. But this riles up Haman. Rubs him that this one guy, this one Jew, stands there defiantly and doesn't bow like everybody else. 3:5. When Haman saw that Mordecai wouldn't kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So Haman is so insulted by this Jew, Mordecai, that he decides not just to try to get rid of him, he wants to get rid of all the Jews. So, and remember, nobody knows that Esther is a Jew. Nobody knows that she's related to Mordecai. Okay? We know it, but Haman doesn't know it. Xerxes doesn't know it. So Haman goes to Xerxes, and notice how cleverly he states his case in verse 8. There is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from those of all the other people, and who don't obey the king's laws. Is it not in the king's best interest it is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them? If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. And I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out the business. But the king took his signet ring from his finger, gave it to Haman, the enemy of the Jews. Keep the money, he said. Do as you please. Now notice Haman never says who these people are. He just says there's a people out there, and they're different, and they're weird, and they're not like us, and they're not obeying our laws, and I think you ought to just get rid of them. And the king's like, okay, whatever, go ahead. He's got other fish to fry. So Haman has a plot for genocide. Haman has a plot he sends out a decree that on a certain day, it's open season on Jews. Anybody can just kill a Jew with no repercussions. So he sends out this, verse 3:13. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. So the order gives out, on this day, kill the Jews. And this spreads all throughout the empire. Well, it spreads all through the author. Chapter 4. Mordecai hears about it. 4:1. Mordecai learned of all that had been done. He tore his clothes. He put on sackcloth and ashes. He went into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate. No one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. And so, in every province, Jews are mourning and fasting and weeping and wailing, it says. Then, Esther hears that he's upset. She sends him clothes. And he sends a message to Esther. He says, show this to Esther. This is verse 8. Show this to Esther, explained it to her, and told her. And he told the messenger to go to Esther and urge her to go to the king and beg for mercy and plead with him. So Mordecai says, you have got to go to the king and stop this. You've got to go to the king and stop this. So they send the message to him. But Esther says, I can't just walk in on the king. No one is allowed to just walk in on the king. You have to be summoned. You have to be called for to go to the king. And he hasn't called for me in a month. And the rule is, if anybody walks in on him without being summoned, they're to be killed on the spot. She says, verse 11, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is that the king to extend the gold scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. So, I can't go in and just walk in on him. Because the rule is, unless you're summoned, you get killed. And so, that gets reported back to Mordecai, and Mordecai sends back this answer. And here, this is the key verse of the whole book. 4:12. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your families, father's family, will perish. Who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this? Now, why do I say that's the key verse of the whole book?
It's quoted a lot.
It is quoted a lot. What did I say is missing from this book?
God. She has to have faith.
Where is God?
He put her in that position.
She says, he says to her, how do you know that you have not been put where you are for such a time as this. In other words, he's saying, you're not where you are by accident. This is not just coincidence. This is not just luck. You are in the position you are in because you have been put in that position for such a time as this. The implication, the word God doesn't appear, but the implication is God has put you there. God put you in the right place at the right time to save your people. And that's why God put you in that palace. That's why God put you in that position, so that you could act right now. And so he says, how do you know that you're not there for a reason? And so she sends back, Esther sends this back message, verse 16. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So she's like, all right, I'll do it. So she fasts 3 days. And then on the third day, she walks in to the king's hall. It said 5:1. The king is sitting on his throne, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. He said, what is it, Queen Esther? What's your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it'll be given to you. Now she's clever. She doesn't say, well, save my people, don't let them be killed. She says, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come to a banquet I've prepared for them. He's like, okay. Sounds good. He tells Haman, the queen wants you and me to come to a banquet. And so they sit down, the three of them. The king asks her again, verse 6. Now what is it you want? It'll be given to you. What's your request? Even up to half the kingdom. What do you want? Now, we've heard this kind of language before. Does he really mean he'll give her half the kingdom? No. No. This is Middle Eastern extravagance. This is Middle Eastern, well, what's the right word? They say things like that.
Exaggeration.
Exaggeration. But it's, of course, it's not to be taken literally. Anything you want. Remember when Solomon's mother, Bathsheba comes to Solomon and says, I've got a request. And he's like, whatever you want, I'll give it to you. And she says, let your brother marry that maid. And he's like, I'll never do that. Well, he just said you'd give her whatever you wanted. Well, no, he didn't really mean it. So he's like, what do you want? What do you want? And she says, well, I want you to come and have another feast with me tomorrow. And then I'll tell you what I want. What I really, really want. So she says, come back tomorrow and I'll tell you what I want. So, guess who thinks he's on top of the world? Haman. He's like, man, just me and the king and the queen. And so he goes home and he says to his wife and his friends, guess what? I am in like Flynn with the king. Verse 12, 5:12. That's not all. I'm the only person Queen Esther's invited to accompany the king in the banquet she gave. She's invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting in the king's gate. With all this praise and all this honor and all this glory, it still galls me that one Jew won't bow down to me. And so his wife says, well, I know. Have a gallows built, 75 feet high, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it. And then he says, okay, that's a great idea. So they have the gallows built. He's on top of the world. Well, again, meantime, that night, the king has insomnia. 6:1. So what do you do when you can't sleep? You read something. So he pulls out the annals, and he happens to read about that incident from when Mordecai stopped the assassination plot. And in the middle of the night, he says to one of his aides, "What did we do to reward this Mordecai guy for this?" Yeah, you know, he stopped an assassination plot. What did we do to honor and reward this Mordecai, the Jew? Like, oh, nothing. And so he said, well, which one of my, my guys, my nobles, who's here at the palace? He went, well, Haman's here. He said, well, bring him in. And here's where, all comedy is based on misunderstanding. Verse 6, he says to Haman, what should be done for the man the king wants to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, for the man the king wants to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with the royal crest on its head. Let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let the robe of the man the king delights in to honor lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. And the king said, go at once and get that robe and get that horse and do just what you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew. You just picture Haman's face like, okay. And so he has to go out and get all this stuff, and he has to lead Mordecai through the streets on the horse, proclaiming, this is what is done for the man the king wants to honor. So, he's thinking, it'd probably be pretty hard to get the guy hanged now. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. Haman rushed home. This is 6:12. With his head covered in grief, he told Zeresh, his wife, and his friends everything that had happened. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you can't stand against him. You'll surely come to ruin. This is a bad sign. It says, while he was still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and said, it's time for the banquet. And now we have the second banquet. Just the king, Esther, and Haman. Chapter 7. The king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And as they were drinking wine on that second day, the king again asked, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It'll be given to you. What's your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it'll be granted. Verse 3, the Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, O king, if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing? And Esther said, the adversary and the enemy is this vile Haman! So, right there, Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, went out of the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, will he even molest the queen while she is with me in my house? As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, a gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He made it for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. And the king's fury subsided. He was, as they say, hoist on his own petard. And so now, this is the denouement of the story, of course, is that this edict has already gone out to kill the Jews, so they have to send out a second edict telling the Jews, hey, you can fight back. But you might think, why didn't they just kill the edict? But it says that they granted the Jews the right to assemble and protect themselves, and the Jews are successful, and they are not killed. And all of this to say, at the end, this is a story. This is why the Jews celebrate a holiday called Purim. Purim. Or in Oklahoma, we might say Purim. Purim. Purim is a Jewish holiday. Purim comes from the word for dice or lots, because they cast lots to decide what day they were going to kill the Jews. That's why it's called Purim. But this is a Jewish holiday, Purim. And it's a holiday that's celebrated in Jewish communities a little differently from most other holidays. And the closest Christian analogy to how they celebrate Purim would be how we, around Christmas time, sometimes have a nativity play. We have kids dressed as shepherds and wise men and Mary and Joseph and angels and all that, and they act out the nativity story, the Christmas story. On Purim, the story of Esther is acted out as a play, as a melodrama. In other words, what happens every time Haman walks on stage? Yeah. What happens every time Mordecai walks on stage? Yay! So it's acted out for Purim as a melodrama, as a play, to recount the story of how Esther and Mordecai saved the Jews from genocide. Now, what 20th century event made this story even more topical? The Holocaust. Because what was Haman's desire? Genocide. To wipe out the Jews. So the parallels between Haman and Hitler are often lifted up. That Hitler is the new Haman. But now, of course, there is a special Jewish Day of Remembrance for the Holocaust as well. Purim is actually a more lighthearted holiday because of this melodrama play and the way it's played up as kind of a, cheer the villain, boo the villain, or cheer the hero, hiss the villain, etc., etc. But Purim is on the Jewish calendar as one of the great, fun Jewish holidays. Now, so why do you think this book doesn't mention God? Why do you think it's in the Bible? Does it belong in the Bible?
It's a reference a couple times.
God's hand is still on it, whether or not his name is in it.
Right. That's been why it was one of the last books to be accepted into the Old Testament by the Jews. It was one of the last. We use this word, the canon. You heard that phrase? The canon of Scripture. The word canon there meaning the rule or the list. And the Old Testament, and I don't know if we talked about that, the Old Testament is really divided into sort of three sections: the law, the prophets, and the writings. And the law is the Pentateuch, what we would call the first 5 books, really plus Joshua. The writings would be, the law, the prophets. The prophets is pretty obvious, the books of prophecy. But, and the history books really go with the law books. But then this third section of the writings is like what we're in now. Esther, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. The so-called writings are the last part of the Jewish canon to be considered sacred scripture. There was even debate, the church tended to say, whatever the Jews have said is scripture, we accept as the Old Testament. So those 39 books that the Jews adopted as their scripture, the church adopted the same 39 books. But there was even debate in the church as to whether Esther belonged in the Bible. There was still a new debate, again, about, since it doesn't mention God, does it really belong in the Bible? And the decision of the church, the early church, and then the church councils in the 3rd and 4th centuries, was that yes, Esther belongs in the Bible because it, as we say, even though it doesn't mention God by name, God's presence is there, especially in that part we talked about, where it says, how do you know that you were not put where you are now for such a time as this? And the word we kind of use to talk about that, is the word we sometimes throw around, the word providence. Word providence, meaning, God is in control. Now, we start talking about providence, we're Wesleyans, at least, and Wesleyans, we don't believe in predestination, which is a whole separate thing. But providence is the idea that God is active in the world. And that sometimes what seems to be luck or a coincidence is more than luck or a coincidence. That God has put somebody in the right place at the right time. And as you say, that verse, how do you know that you have not been put where you are for such a time as this, doesn't just fit Esther's story. There's a lot of times where we might say, I was in a particular place at a particular time because I needed to do something. I needed to meet that person. I needed to share that particular story, or I needed to help that person in that time of moment of trial. I had this kind of happen to me last week on my birthday, and I'm not a big Facebook person, but on your birthday, people, sometimes we're on Facebook, happy birthday, which is nice and wonderful. I had a message from a man that had been in my church 2 churches back when I was a pastor in Oklahoma City. And it was more than just a happy birthday message. It was saying, telling me happy birthday and then saying, when I first visited Quail Springs Methodist, which is where I was pastor in Oklahoma City, he said, I hadn't been to church in 15 years. My fiance really wanted us to go to church, and I didn't really want to, but she kind of dragged me there. And this is when Quail Springs was still meeting in a shopping center. And he said, at the end, you were greeting people, and he said, you said to me, wow, is that a Watchman button that you're wearing? Watchman is a comic book. He was wearing a button that goes with that comic book. It's now an HBO thing, yeah. And he said, I said to him, is that a Watchman button? And he said, I couldn't believe a pastor knew what that was. I couldn't believe there was a pastor who knew that about something that I was interested in. I couldn't believe it, he said. He said, we kept coming back. I gave my life to Christ. I became a Christian. I wanted you to know how that happened. And, again, you think, well, I was in the right place at the right time for that particular young man at that time. And, a lot of us can have, I think, stories like that. We may not ever get a note telling us about it, but a lot of times you're in the right place at the right time to talk to a particular person, to be there to comfort somebody or encourage somebody or share the gospel with somebody or, whatever. And you realize, wow, what a coincidence. But sometimes I don't think it is a coincidence. I think it's I think it is providence. It's you. How do you know you were not put here for such a time as this? So, anyway. Well, the book of Job is not quite as fun as Esther. I think Esther is actually a pretty fun book, even though, Haman, it's not fun for Haman, but the way it kind of all unfolds, and, especially that dramatic moment where the king's like, who could do such a thing? And Esther's like, this guy, and you can just see him turning white at that moment. Job is probably the most challenging book in the Bible, in a lot of ways. It's challenging subject matter, it's challenging reading, because all but a couple of chapters of Job is poetry. Job is an epic poem. And because Job is an epic poem, many people would say, well, it's not really, like when does it happen or where does it happen? And it's very mysterious. And a lot of people, and I would probably be one of them, would say Job is more like a parable than it is like history. Job is more an extended parable, partially because it's a poem. And usually poems are kind of telling you that there's something here that's different from just straightforward history. So it's written as a poem, except for the prologue and the postlude or whatever. And the prologue that sets up the poem is in the first 2 chapters. And the prologue of Job sets up the story that there is a man named Job. He lives in Uz, which is difficult to pin down exactly where that is. But he's an incredibly wealthy man. And we're told right up front, Job 1:1, he was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and large numbers of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. An incredibly wealthy man. And it says, his sons used to take turns holding feasts in their homes, and they'd invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a period of feasting had run its course, Job would send and have them purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. And this was his regular custom. Like, just in case they've done something, I'm going to offer a sacrifice for them. Then, our viewpoint shifts to the throne of God. And it says angels, which here the Hebrew means the sons of God, come before Yahweh, and one of them is the Satan. The Satan. There's some words that we think of as proper words that really aren't. For example, the word Christ. Jesus' last name was not Christ. Jesus was not born to Joseph and Mary Christ. Christ is not Jesus' last name. It is Jesus' title, the Christ. Because the word Christ, Christos, is the Greek form of the Jewish word Messiah, or anointed one. So, if we were really being, that is an A by the way, if we were really being careful, we wouldn't say Jesus Christ, we would say Jesus the Christ. But we don't. But Jesus the Christ, Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the anointed one. Well, the word Satan is the same way. The Satan. The word Satan means the adversary, or the accuser. So, the Satan, the adversary, the accuser. Now, the devil does have a proper name in the New Testament, which is, no, Lucifer. Yeah. Yeah. Which, by the way, means son of the morning. So Lucifer is a proper name, but Satan, the Satan, is not. Satan means adversary or accuser. So it says, the angels were presenting themselves before the Lord, and the accuser, the adversary, came with them. And the Lord said to the accuser, "Where have you come from?" And the Satan answered, "From roaming through the earth and going back and forth for it." And the Lord said to the Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? Have you seen this guy? There's no one on earth like him. He's blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You've blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. Sure he's good, because you keep rewarding him. Sure he's good, because you keep giving him all this stuff. He's a wealthy man. Why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't he? But if you took it all away from him, he'd curse you to your face. And he says, well, okay. We'll see if you're right. Take everything away from him. And so he does. And then we have one thing after another. Verse 14, the ox were plowing, the donkeys were grazing, and the Sabaeans attacked and carried them off. And they killed the servants, and I'm the only one who escaped. And while he's still there, another guy arrives. Fire fell from the sky and burned up your sheep and the servants, and I'm the only one who escaped. And while he's still talking, the Chaldeans formed raiding parties and swept up your camels and killed your servants, and I'm the only one to escape. And while he's still speaking, another one comes. Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking, and a wind struck, and the house collapsed, and they're all dead. And I'm the only one who escaped. All of this bang, 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 bang. Now, you see why I say this is a parable. And so Job falls down, and does he curse God at that point? No. He fell to the ground in worship and said, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I will depart. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. May the name of the Lord be praised. We've heard that little phrase. The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. So, God says to the Satan, ha, see, I was right. So, the Satan comes back. And the Lord says to him, verse 3, 2-3, have you noticed Job? There's no one like him. He's blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil, and he still maintains his integrity, even though you incited me against him, to ruin him without any reason. Skin for skin. Skin for skin, Satan replied. A man will give all he has for his own life. Stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he'll curse you to your face. All right. He's in your hands. So now Job is afflicted with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. He sits in the ashes and scrapes his sores with a piece of broken pottery. And his wife says to him, are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die. And he says, you're talking like a foolish woman. Should we accept good from God and not trouble? And in all of this, he did not sin. So, he's lost everything now. And when word gets out, 3 of his friends come to comfort him. It says they come to sympathize with him and comfort him. Verse 12, 2:12. When they saw him from a distance, they could barely recognize him. They began to weep out loud. They tore their robes, sprinkled dust on their heads. They sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him. They saw how great his suffering was. So for a week, nobody even spoke. Now that's the prologue. First 2 chapters of the prologue. Now the poem starts. And you can say, have you ever heard the term Job's comforters? It is said with sarcasm. Because Job's comforters are anything but. Job's comforters, his 3 so-called friends, provide no comfort at all. So now we have a series of speeches, of poems, and it goes, Job will talk, and then one of his so-called friends talks, and then Job answers, and then another one of his friends talks, and then Job answers, and then another one of his friends talks, and it goes around and around and around. So this goes on, as you can see, from chapter 3. The poem goes all the way through chapter 38. No, farther than that. The poem part goes all the way into chapter 42. The epilogue starts in the middle of chapter 42. So obviously we're not going to read 40 chapters of poetry. But we'll read a few selected parts of this. And as I say, this is not it's not an easy book because it's poetry, and 2, because the subject matter is so difficult. Job starts off by saying this, chapter 3. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. He said, "May the day of my birth perish, and the night it was said, a boy is born. That day may it turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine upon it. May darkness and deep shadow claim it once more. May a cloud settle over it. May blackness overwhelm its light. That night may thick darkness seize it. May it not be included among the days of the year, nor be entered into any of the months. May that night be barren. May no shout of joy be heard in it. May those who curse days curse that day. Those who are ready to rouse Leviathan. May its morning stars become dark. May it wait for daylight in vain, and not see the first rays of dawn. For it did not shut the doors of the womb on me, and hide trouble from my eyes. Why did I not perish at birth, and die as I came from the womb?" It goes on that happy note pretty much for the rest of Job is saying, why was I born? Why didn't I die at birth? I cursed the day of my birth. And then jump down to verse 23. Why is life given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? For sighing comes to me instead of food. My groans pour out like water. What I feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, only turmoil. So he's saying, everything about my life is awful. I wish I'd never been born. I curse the day of my birth. Everything is horrible. Then one of his friends, his comforters, starts to speak. And let me pull out just a couple of verses, like 4:7. Consider now, who being innocent has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? As I have observed, those who plow evil and those who sow trouble reap it. At the breath of God they are destroyed. At the blast of his anger they perish. The lions may roar and growl, yet the teeth of the great lions are broken. The lion perishes for lack of prey, and the cubs of the lioness are scattered. He goes on, basically his point is, suffering is the result of what? Sin. People who suffer are paying the price of their sins. So, So, in other words, Eliphaz is saying what to Job? You did something to deserve this. You did something. And you're being punished for your sins. And he spends a couple of chapters basically saying that. He said, 5:17, blessed is the man whom God corrects. So don't despise the discipline of the Almighty. For he wounds, but he also binds up. He injures, but his hands also heal. From 6 calamities he'll rescue you. From 7 no harm will befall you. In famine he will ransom you. From death, in battle from the stroke of the sword. You'll be protected from the lash of the tongue and need not fear when destruction comes. Basically, God will take care of you. And he ends his speech by saying, we've examined this, it's true. Hear it and apply it to yourself. So, confess what you've done. And Job says, if only my anguish could be weighed and all my misery be placed on the scales, it would surely outweigh the sand of the seas. No wonder my words have been impetuous. He goes on to Isaiah 6:24, teach me and I'll be quiet. Show me where I have been wrong. How painful are honest words. But what do your arguments prove? Do you mean to correct what I say and treat the words of a despairing man as wind? You'd even cast lots for the fatherless and barter away your friend. But now, be so kind as to look at me. Would I lie to your face? Relent. Do not be unjust. Reconsider, for my integrity is at stake. Is there any wickedness on my lips? Can my mouth not discern malice? In other words, show me, tell me what I've done to deserve this. What have I done? And that goes on, and then one of his other friends says to him, chapter 8, how long will you say such things? Your words are like a blustering wind. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert what is right? When your children sinned against him, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin. In other words, they did something to deserve this. You did something to deserve this. You're being punished. 8:20. Surely God does not reject a blameless man or strengthen the hands of evildoers. He will yet fill your mouth with laughter and your lips with shouts of joy. Your enemies will be clothed in shame. The tents of the wicked will be no more. Just fess up. Then Job basically says, how can I argue with God? I want God to tell me what I've done. I want God to explain this to me. 9:14. How then can I dispute with him? How can I find words to argue with him? Though I were innocent, I couldn't answer him. I can only plead with my judge for mercy. In other words, I just want God to let me know what I've done. Or explain it to me. Let me defend myself. Let me talk to him. Jumping to chapter 10. Job is still talking. I loathe my very life. Therefore I'll give free rein to my complaint. Speak out in the bitterness of my soul. I'll say to God, don't condemn me. Tell me what charges you have against me. Does it please you to oppress me, to spurn the work of your hands, while you smile on the schemes of the wicked? Do you have eyes of flesh? Do you see as a mortal sees? Are your days like those of a mortal, or are your years like those of a man? That you must search out my faults and probe after my sin? Though you know that I am not guilty, and that no one can rescue me from your hand. So, he's saying, God, you know I have not sinned. Well, Zophar, the third friend, echoes his first two. Again, makes the same accusation. You've done something to deserve it. Job replies again, and it gets more and more hostile.
More and more what?
Hostile.
Hostile.
his friends become more and more harsh in condemning him, and he becomes more and more adamant in demanding that he's innocent. And they keep pressing him, and matter of fact, let's look at 13. My eyes have seen all this. My ears have heard and understand it. What you know, I also know. I'm not inferior to you. I desire to speak to the Almighty and to argue my case with God. You, however, smear me with lies. You are worthless physicians, all of you. If only you would be altogether silent. For you, that would be wisdom. Hear now my argument. Listen to the plea of my lips. Will you speak wickedly on God's behalf? Will you speak deceitfully for him? Will you show him partiality? Will you argue the case for God? Would it turn out well if he examined you? Could you deceive him as you might deceive men? He would surely rebuke you if you secretly showed partiality. Would not his splendor terrify you? Would not the dread of him fall on you? Your maxims are proverbs of ashes. Your defenses are defenses of clay. This is not very comforting. And again, Job demands, 13:23, how many wrongs or sins have I committed? Show me my offense and my sin. Why do you hide your face and consider me your enemy? He's talking to God. Well, again, this keeps going and going, chapter after chapter. Eliphaz in 15 says, 15:5, your sin prompts your mouth. You adopt the tongue of the crafty. Your own mouth condemns you, not mine. Your own lips testify against you. 19:1, how long will you torment me and crush me with words? 10 times now you've reproached me. Shamelessly you attack me. If it's true that I've gone astray, my error remains my concern alone. If indeed you would exalt yourselves above me and use my humiliation against me, then know that God has wronged me and drawn his net around me. Though I cry, I've been wronged, I get no response. Though I call for help, there is no justice. At the end of that chapter, he says, have pity on me, my friends, have pity. For the hand of God has struck me. Why do you pursue me as God does? Will you never get enough of my flesh? Oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead, or engraved in rock forever. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth. After my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes. I and not another, how my heart yearns within me. That little phrase, I know that my Redeemer lives. You've probably heard that. Did you realize the context that it is spoken from Job? So, this goes on, and on, and on. And chapter after chapter, and on and on, and on and on. And then, we get to chapter 32, and a fourth guy walks in. Elihu. You know, they have the three so-called comforters. A new guy walks in chapter 32, who's a young guy, not one of his old friends, but a young guy, and he makes his own case, but basically says all the same thing. He must have done something to deserve this. And speaks from his perspective, but the same stuff. And so, we're like, where is this going? We get to chapter 38. And who speaks? God. And God says, you see, I had this bet with Satan. Is that what he said?
No.
Nope. Not at all. He never says a word about that. What God says, 38:4. Actually, 38:2. Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man, I'll question you, and you'll answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched out a measuring line across it? Or what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and the angels shouted for joy? Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness? When I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place? When I said, this far you may come and no farther. Here is where your proud waves halt. Have you ever given orders to the morning, or shown the dawn its place, that it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it? The earth takes shape like clay under a seal. Its features stand out like those of a garment. The wicked are denied their light, and their upraised arm is broken. Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you seen the gates of the shadow of death? Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. And it goes on like that for quite a while, which seems to be, if we could narrow that down to a sentence or two, what's God's response?
Are you God there?
What?
Are you God?
Are you God? Do you know what I know? Have you seen what I've seen? How satisfying is that answer?
Not very.
Not very. To be really honest. Not a very satisfying answer. And that's why this book is such a difficult book, because the answer in this poem that God gives is, I'm God and you're not. And you don't know everything. There's things you don't know. You weren't there at the moment of creation. You don't know what I know. And it goes on for 2 or 3 chapters like that, of him basically saying that, see, these same rhetorical questions. Like 39. Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you watch when the doe bears her fawn? And I mean, all these things, which of course we as humans don't know. And all these things all across the earth, all these mysteries of the universe. He says, do you know all this? And finally, Job answers in 40 verse 4, chapter 40 verse 4. I'm unworthy, how can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, and I'll say no more. And then God kind of says some more stuff about, do you know all this? And then Job replies again, 42. I know that you can do all things. No plan of yours can be thwarted. You ask, who is this that obscures my counsel without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I don't understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now and I'll speak, and I'll question you and you'll answer me. My ears have heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. So Job's like, you're right. I don't know anything. But then the epilogue. This is 42:7. After the Lord had said these things to Job, he said to Eliphaz, the Temanite, one of the so-called comforters, I am angry with you and your 2 friends, because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. What is he saying about the 3 friends' argument?
That theory of you had to have done something wrong.
What about that theory?
Well, it's wrong.
It's wrong.
It's not God's.
He says, I'm angry with you 3 because you have misrepresented me in saying that all suffering is the result of sin. He says to the 3 friends, I'm mad at you for misrepresenting me. You haven't spoken truthfully about me like Job has. He's not mad at Job, he's commending Job. You have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. So now take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. My servant Job will pray for you, and I'll accept his prayer, and not deal with you according to your folly. You have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. So Eliphaz the Temanite, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite did what the Lord told him, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. After Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord made him prosperous again and gave him twice as much as he had before. All his brothers and sisters and everyone who had known him before came and ate with him in his house. They comforted and consoled him over all the trouble the Lord had brought upon him. Each one gave him a piece of silver and a gold ring. The Lord blessed the later part of Job's life more than the first. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 donkeys. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. And then he named them all these names, and nowhere were there women as beautiful as Job's daughters. After this, Job lived 140 years. He saw his children and their children to the 4th generation, and so he died, old and full of years. So, yeah.
Some friends and I just labored through Job a few weeks ago,
Yeah.
and the beauty we found in part of it, as a side note, is that they hardly ever use the same word twice. And there was a real beauty to the way that was put together, even though the story was not really the best.
Oh yeah, the language is I mean, it's a poem. It's Hebrew poetry. And it is, yeah, it's very beautifully, it's a very beautiful poem. It's sometimes rather hard to get through.
Yeah, it was tough to get through.
Now, if you had to say, all right, what is the message that we are to get from this book?
Several of them.
Okay, never lose faith. That's probably good.
Well, they spent the first half of the book practically saying why.
Yeah.
In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. In John.
Yeah.
Satan doesn't reappear. He doesn't have any final words, does he?
No. No.
I
He
mean,
doesn't.
Lucifer.
Yeah. Well, you know, some people are even not sure if, well, I mean, you know, is here the adversary or the accuser, is this the same as Lucifer? There's some debate about that. Although most people would probably have them be the same person or entity. Do you remember a story over in John, in the New Testament, where they run across a man who's blind? And remember what the disciples asked Jesus?
What sin has he done,
Right.
or his parents have done?
Right, they say, is he blind because of his sin or because of his parents' sin? And what is the answer Jesus gives?
Neither one.
Neither one.
For the glory of God.
So, you know, this idea that God here in Job says is not true, that suffering is always the result of sin. The book of Job has God saying that's not true. So, you know, 500 years later, in the time of Jesus, are people still believing that?
Yes.
Uh-huh. His own disciples. Why is this guy blind? Did he sin or his parents sin? And Jesus says, neither. Do people still believe it today, 2,000 years later?
Yes.
Why?
Because they haven't been taught different.
We have to have an excuse.
Have to have someone to blame.
So, is it because people haven't read what these people, what, you know, things like Jesus saying neither? Is it because, you know, is it because there's,
Guilt and blame. Guilt on our own part, blame on others.
Sin has consequences, so, maybe that's the consequences of your sin.
Yeah, now sometimes sin does lead to consequences. I mean,
Well, yeah.
yeah, sometimes, if you rob a bank, you're probably gonna go to jail. I mean, there's a consequence to that action.
Right.
If you drink, 2 pints of whiskey every day, your liver's gonna be shot. That's a consequence of your actions.
Right.
On and on and on. We can name all kinds of situations where somebody does something, and indeed there is a consequence. They go to jail, they get fined, they lose a family member, people abandon them because of their treatment. There's all kinds of places where, yes, sometimes your behavior does have consequences. But I think this story is saying that every sorrow and every trouble is not traceable to sin. Sometimes things just happen. Somebody gets hit by a drunk driver. What did that person do to deserve getting hit by that drunk driver? Nothing.
Well, we don't know the big picture.
Illnesses are the same way.
Uh-huh.
We do the same thing with illnesses, and the doctors will say, it's the way it is, it's the way it happens.
This is, I would say, the hardest question that humanity asks. At least people who are people of faith.
It rains on the just and unjust alike.
It does, right.
Right.
But the question that people of faith have asked since the time of Job and before and ever since is, why do bad things happen to good people?
Yes.
It's sometimes called the problem of evil. There's a technical word for it in theology, it's called theodicy. Not the Odyssey, but theodicy, but it means, it's just the problem of how do we explain the existence of evil? How do we explain when bad things happen to good people? Some people, especially atheists, say, well, if God was truly all-powerful and all good, evil wouldn't exist. There wouldn't be any evil. If God was all-powerful and God is all good, then evil shouldn't ever exist. But, the story of Genesis, whether you take it literally or metaphorically, says, what about us humans?
He gave us free will.
We have this thing called free will.
Yeah.
And God made the decision to give us free will, which truly having free will means even you can choose to do bad stuff, to do evil. And the Bible also says, we live in a broken world. And the Bible says this world is not our final destination. This world is not, world is not the end, it's the beginning. But yeah, people still, to this day, you're right, illness, if they have, something, especially, something happens to a child or a family member, why? Why, God? Why did you do this to my child? Why did you do this to my relative? Why did you allow this to happen? And the witness of Scripture is, that's not the right question to ask. God doesn't send sickness and disaster upon us because we've sinned. The tornado doesn't hit your house because you, out of all the people, have. And so, I've heard crazy TV evangelists. When there's a natural disaster hits a city, try to say, well, this is God punishing that city because of.
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Huh? You think, well, has that city done really more evil than, it gets hit by the tornado or the flood or the hurricane? Is that city really more evil than, you think if that was true, the place that would get hit would be Las Vegas, right? It would be, it's right in the name, Sin City, right? So, Job is not an easy book. But the things I do appreciate about it, one is this constant message. It's not, people don't suffer suffering is not always the result of sin. But also that Job is, he's mad at God. He's basically arguing with God. Is God at the end punishing him for that anger? Or
No.
Okay, he says, my servant Job.
He never disavows God.
No, he never
gets angry.
disagrees with
He
God.
never
He's angry with
disavows.
him. He doesn't understand. He's like, God, answer me, I don't get it, and
He's
why are
still
you doing
alive.
it? But he never curses God. That was the whole point. Satan says, if you take all this stuff from me, he'll curse you. He'll curse you. He never does. He never curses God. He says, I know that my Redeemer lives. But he says, I don't understand the God. Which, one of the things about the Old Testament, that I think you've seen already from Moses and Abraham and all these other people, they often argue with God. And God doesn't get mad at them for arguing with him. It's okay to argue with God. Just like it's okay to argue with your family. As long as you make up. As long as you're somebody you love, you're going to occasionally butt heads with. And, God is big enough to take it. God can, when we're upset with God and we tell him honestly, God, I'm really upset with you right now, that's okay. You don't have to hide your feelings from God, even anger. But, God would rather we be mad at him than ignore him.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
In the very beginning of this, wasn't it God who allowed Satan to have his way?
Yeah, and that's why I say I think this is more of a parable than it is a historical story. I think it's a parable that sets up this conversation about evil. Yeah, and that whole thing, does God allow evil? Well, God allows free will. God allows us to make choices. And God, the Bible says death is the result of sin. But Jesus has conquered sin and therefore conquered death. But yeah, you say, does God allow suffering? Well, yes, God, and you can kind of set up kind of almost ridiculous things. If I standing on the rim of a canyon and I take a step forward and I start to plummet to the ground, why didn't God catch me? Why didn't God, God allowed me to fall to my death? Well, we live in this world of natural laws and gravity and everything else. I say God allows suffering. Well, God, if this world was all that there is, I think you could say, well, God's just not very fair, because here's an evil guy who lived to be old and comfortable and rich, and here's a good guy who died young and poor. And you'd say there's no justice in the universe. But that's only if this life is all that there is. And of course, Paul says if this life is all that there is, then Christianity is pretty much, he says we ought to just roll up our tent. He says if this is all that there is, we Christians are the most pitiful of people. He says, but then he thunders back, but Christ is resurrected. Christ is alive. And because of that, we do not need to fear death. And there's more. There's more to life than this life. Now, this life is pretty important, but it's not the whole story. But the question of suffering, as I said, the question of the problem of evil is one that is not, there's no easy answers. It's not like, here's a nice simple answer. That's why there have been thousands of books written on it. C.S. Lewis has written one of my favorite books on it called The Problem of Evil. There's a reason. It's a problem. It's a problem that Lewis tackles from lots of different angles, and lots of other theologians have done the same thing. All the way back to, the early theologians from the first few centuries up through modern times. It's not an easy, cliche kind of answer to problem. And I think that's why Job is helpful, because Job doesn't give easy answers. It's tough to digest. It's the hardest book in the Bible, I think, for us to digest. But I think it also makes us realize that, wrestling with the problem of evil is part of what it means to be human. There was a popular book back in the 70s, maybe early 80s, called When Bad Things Happen to Good People.
Still popular.
It was written by a rabbi named Harold Kushner. And his answer is basically, well, God can't do anything about it, which I don't think is a very satisfying answer either. The answer is not simple, though. And in some ways, the answer Job gives, which is we don't know everything, is not very satisfying, but it's also probably one of the best answers there is. We don't know everything. And, there'll be someday, like Paul says, now we're looking through a glass darkly, but someday we'll look clearly, and I think there'll come a time in which we will say, oh, this makes more sense now. And now I understand a lot more than I did. And when people say, well, what about this person, and is this really fair? I have no doubt that in eternity we won't be able to say to God, well, God, that's just not fair. I don't think we'll be saying that. But how that'll all work out, I don't understand all things. But I'm glad this book's in the Bible, even though I don't maybe like it. I wouldn't say it's my favorite book of the Bible by any means, but I think it's there for a reason. For such a reason as this, right? So I thought about switching and doing Job first, so we'd end on Esther and have a little more of a little more happy note, but I thought we better do them in order.